Today is Chicago Bulls Media Day with training camp opening officially tomorrow. And today's the day that kind of is the unofficial start of a new NBA season where we're going to hear from Arturas Karnisovas, Billy Donovan, the Chicago Bulls players, and the hope is hopefully going to be renewed heading into this season. But we're going to talk about Josh Giddy and how Josh Giddy could impact kind of the Bulls' direction going forward. And ultimately, I'm going to say this is another chance for the Chicago Bulls to get things right, and they better not fuck it up. We're going to get into all that plus the mailbag right after this.
You are now tuned in to Chicago Bulls Central, your number one place for all Chicago Bulls news and content.
What's going on, Bulls fans? Welcome to another episode of Chicago Bulls Central, your number one spot for everything Chicago Bulls related. I'm the host here, Haize, but more importantly, you guys can follow the channel at Bulls Central Pod on every social media platform we happen to be on. With that being said, let's go ahead and get into this content for today. And I want to start off with this one. This was an article from Bleacher Report in which they questioned Josh Giddy's role going into next season, but more importantly, how it directly correlates with Coby White and his ascension and the Bulls potentially finding a trade partner for Zach LaVine. I thought this was an interesting angle that they took on it, and I want to talk about it and discuss it here. Of course, they point out Josh Giddy and the fact that the Bulls moved one of their better assets in Alex Caruso, and the fact that they prioritized Josh Giddy over getting draft compensation back for moving Alex Caruso, in which they could have moved at other deals to get draft compensation. They really prioritized Josh Giddy. And I think in all of this, right, in talking about it and me looking at what the possible fit could be next to Coby White and Zach LaVine and how Josh Giddy, as a 21-year-old who still has shown and, been top 10 in triple-doubles each year and has grown in a lot of areas of his game since his rookie year, and he's had seasons where he's put up some really impressive box score stats. The thing with Josh Giddy here is that what the Bulls are hoping for in getting him is a player that they don't have to necessarily spend as much time developing as if they did get draft picks, right? When it comes down to it, if the Bulls got draft compensation back for Alex Caruso, when is that draft compensation? What's the depth in that draft? How well have the Bulls scouted in that draft? And then it also comes down to the Bulls' own evaluation of talent in drafts, which is shaky to say the least. So in getting a player in Josh Giddy that has proven what he can do to a degree at the NBA level, you're hoping that coming in here, putting him in a position where he's going to be able to hopefully, kind of thrive in what he's best at doing, right? And be in a position where he's able to take best advantage of the skill set that he has. That's what the Bulls are kind of hoping for, is that long-term fit, especially with Josh Giddy and Coby White, presents something that's not just good for the present, but also the future for the Chicago Bulls. But it's also some questions about that, right? With Josh Giddy, and you look at his lack of shooting, which means that primarily you're going to have to put him on ball, right? You're going to have to, have him as your primary distributor, run your offense through him a lot, because if you take Josh Giddy off ball, what we saw that when it worked with, when he was with OKC Thunder, is that really, it makes Josh Giddy, it makes it easier for other teams to marginalize Josh Giddy by, putting a defender on him and keeping him from getting the ball. So by putting the ball in Josh Giddy's hands and having him run your offense, you're making him more of a weapon that can be utilized. But, one of the things that come in here with is that you're looking at Coby White, you're looking at putting him with Zach LaVine, and Coby White, much better on-ball player last season, right? We've already talked about how with pull-ups and, with shooting drives, things like that, he's better with the ball in his hands. He hasn't necessarily been the best off-ball player as of yet. You also look at Zach LaVine. While there's some fit there as far as what Zach LaVine is able to do in catch and shoot, the one thing that you're also worried about as well is that with Josh Giddy and how much he's going to have the ball in his hands, at least in this article is what they present, is how much could that potentially devalue Zach LaVine. Now, I get it. It's writer looking for an angle in an article, and I think it's a pretty good one to have, but let's be clear here. Zach LaVine's value is already in the toilet, right? Like, I think that's one thing that we have, pretty much established this offseason, is that the market for Zach LaVine is not high. So I don't necessarily see Josh Giddy coming in here and negatively impacting the value of Zach LaVine, because the value has not been that great already. Right now, one could say, I can see a world in which it can actually help, especially with his playmaking ability. Again, he's in 90th percentile as far as generating open shots for his teammates, so that's a really good thing there as far as how with Zach LaVine's catch and shoot ability, you hope for that to work. But the Kobe White part of this is kind of the most concerning thing. And I've talked about this ad nauseum. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on this again. But overall, the fit of Josh Giddy and Kobe White is one of the more interesting things. And I think one of the biggest storylines that the Bulls are going to have to try to figure out in this training camp and in preseason is how well do those two as a backcourt play together, right? And so, I know I've seen, some people that are like, oh, well, Josh Giddy can play small forward. He's a point guard. He's been best at being a point guard. He's been better at guarding point guards. And so when you have a player that's not versatile and it forces you to try to make your other players versatile, it really comes down to the system that they're in. And I think that's the ultimate concern here is where it should be are the Bulls coaching staff going to be able to create a system where you look at the four players that have all kind of need the ball, and Io has not necessarily had to be as ball dominant, but again, he's been better with the ball in his hands. The Josh Giddy, Kobe White, Zach LaVine, Io DeSumo, that dynamic of those four players is going to be so interesting to watch how that develops, because you have the young guys in Io and in Kobe White, and Josh Giddy's young too, but I mean in the sense that those guys have already been here under a Bulls uniform. They're under 25 years old, and they showed you an ability to make that next step, right? They took a step up for the Chicago Bulls last season, and you're now, changing their roles quite comfortably, and they look like a backcourt that maybe had some really nice symmetry to them last season at times. And as that season ended, the balance between those guys looked really good, especially the offense, defense, Io stepping up offensively, Kobe White stepping up a little bit defensively, and how that kind of met in the middle with their previous skills. And so you're trying to figure out that dynamic between those four players, and that's one of the most important things I think is ahead of the coaching staff heading into this season, is trying to figure out a system and a scheme that makes sense and works for those guys, and those guys buying into it. And they're going to have to sacrifice, right? Sacrificing part of your game to maybe benefit in other areas is how's the best way it's going to work. And so, I know we have a lot of other storylines. Yesterday's episode, we talked about some of the questions heading into training camp, the biggest questions facing the Chicago Bulls, but just one of the better storylines and things to watch of how it affects the present and the future for the Bulls is how that dynamic between those four players work. Because, like I've said many times, is that if the Kobe White, Josh Giddy backcourt does not work, if it just does not work, how much time do you invest in hoping that it's going to work? Or have you learned from other examples around the league of when you try to force a guard to be off ball when they've told you they need to be on ball? How much of that, have you learned from those other teams, or how long are you going to try to force that if it seems like it's not working? Hopefully it does work, right? This is a team that, I think working out kinks, working out balance, working out development, that needs to be the focus of the Bulls this year. And if they can win while doing that, great. But the Bulls have put themselves in a situation with the acquisition of Josh Giddy that now you have to try to figure something out, because at the end of this year, his contract's up, right? He's a restricted free agent. You have to make a decision on what you want to do with Josh Giddy long term, and then the following offseason, you have to make a decision on what you want to do with Kobe White long term. So this is just the first step of a more long-term decision that has to be made with both these players, and a more long-term direction for this team. And so I think that's a really important kind of theme and thing to watch out for. And then with the Zach LaVine part, right? If this three-player dynamic between Kobe, Giddy, and LaVine works, because Io, as I said on yesterday's episode, I see him being the glue guy. He's the Bulls' most important bench piece right now. I see that's going to work. But if the dynamic between those three players just looks like absolute trash, or if it works, right? Let's say that it does work. Let's say that you get Josh Giddy, Kobe White, Zach LaVine all rocking and rolling, and they actually look like a 1-2-3 punch that actually has something there that you can build off on. Then what does that mean for the future of Zach LaVine? Do you not try to move him? What does that mean for the future of Modest Busilis, who could be a 3 initially? Or, again, he could very well, as he puts on weight, takes over that 4 position. Like, it's a lot of moving pieces with this Bulls team, and we were not just, as fans, just zoomed up in the now, right? It's easy to just look at this and say, how many games are the Bulls going to win this season? But it's more important about how they get there, the dynamic that are fit, the balance that's struck, right? The chemistry that's built between these players, and not just these 3 players, but in this topic and in looking at this article, it's really an important piece of that. So I guess we'll see what comes of that, but it is a question heading into training camp for this team. But think the most important thing as we get into our next topic that with this is that the front office can't fuck this up again. Like, I get it. The front office was aggressive about going out and getting DeMar, getting Alex Caruso, getting Alonzo Ball. The year prior to that, getting Nikola Vucevic. They made aggressive moves. But the problem is that that's it. They stopped at that point, right? Like, I'm not to always keep going back to the New York Knicks, but the Knicks saw a glimmer, right? They saw that little bit of area where, hey, we have this piece. And they've been aggressive at building around that since, making several moves. And we'll see how those moves work. But the Bulls have to pick a direction in the storyline of what this team is going to be, right? Win or lose, whatever it is, once you figure out what this team is, meaning that by midseason, by the trade deadline, if this looks like a team that can compete for a play-in or, God forbid, a playoff spot, if we are looking like a team that's surprising and making some moves, all right, dive into that direction. Now, much like they did with the DeMar DeRozan, you can't make the win now moves too early. If you do, you're stuck in a roster that doesn't necessarily make sense. You don't want to make it too early. You want to make substantial moves, aggressive moves, kind of help kind of add some more clarity. And then as you add that clarity, that's when you start to make the bigger swings at things, right? But I think one of the biggest things, the most important things in the season is allowing the direction and the roster to tell you where they are. If this Bulls team by the trade deadline is looking like they're going to be more towards that 28 win prediction that the betting sites have for the Bulls, guess what you got to do at that point? Guess what you got to do at that point? You have to realize you're about to be a bad team. And to me, at that point, you have to double down on then moving your veteran pieces. Torrey Craig, Nikola Vucevic, Zach LaVine, moving these pieces, getting these guys out of here to then, hey, let's finish the season. It is what it is, but we're keeping our pick. Now, I'm not saying that this season has to be built all around that going in. I do think that you have to allow what this roster is telling you of where they are and ranked in the East and in the league overall, and you got to believe it. And then you have to pick a direction for that of where they are, right? And if you are shaping up to be more of a 28-win team, there's no one singular move you're going to make that's going to all of a sudden take you from that to being a playoff team. There's just not. This Bulls team made marginal moves for the last 3 years. For a roster that told you we're getting worse. For a roster that told you the fit concerns are legit. For a roster that told you, hey, what are we doing here? We need this. You have to go out and get it, right? If you're in win now mode, truly in win now mode, you got to continually be aggressive to stay where you're at. The East keeps passing up the Chicago Bulls. The East keeps passing us up. When you look at where we were at the end of 2021 and where we were in the standings, we were better than a lot of teams that had some hope at that point in time. Now the Bulls sit in a place where they're just not that anymore, right? The Atlanta Hawks were worse than the Chicago Bulls in 2021. The Cleveland Cavaliers were a worse team as far as record-wise than the Chicago Bulls in 2021. These are teams that have gotten better since that time, right? The Philadelphia 76ers have dropped and risen back up. The Milwaukee Bucks have made several changes, like the Bucks, the Miami Heat, and the Boston Celtics all finished 2021, 2022 above the Chicago Bulls. And these are teams that have been even more aggressive than the Chicago Bulls at the time. The Knicks, at the end of the 2021-22 season, the New York Knicks were a 37-win team. Now look at where they are. The Indiana Pacers were a 25-win team. Now look at where they are. The Orlando Magic were a 22-win team, the worst team in the Eastern Conference. Look at now where they are. There have been other teams below and around you that have continually made moves to get better while you have made moves to stay get worse. The Bulls have gotten worse every year since then. We've been on the wrong side of history. And if you're going to be a team that can't compete with those teams that are above you, you have to do it through the draft. You have to build it organically. It's not coming in free agency. The Bulls have never been a big free agent destination. You're not going to make a trade with pieces that the league have already showed you that you're not going to hit a huge swing as far as getting back a player that drastically changes your direction by moving Zach or moving Vooch or moving Torrey Craig. You can now get pieces that you can then use that to try to find that guy. But that one player is not coming in. Again, if this team is at a place where they are just struggling to get by, you have to allow the direction that we're in to be evident and then to live in that direction. Find your present and find your future. You have to do both this season. Where are you at presently? And then how do you get better than that in the future? That's what you need to do. How much longer can this Bulls front office be content with no real direction or progress? That is the biggest question for me coming into this training camp period, because we've lived here way too long of not making any real forward progress. We've been a team that's wheels have just been spinning, and we ain't been going nowhere except going home in the offseason. That's where we've been going. We've seen individual progress. The season that Kobe White has had, great to see last season. The growth that Ayo Dosunmu had, great to see last season. But you have to now put yourself in a situation where you can use that to then get further. And right now, like I said, I know there are some Bulls fans that hold out that great hope that this team could be a 40-win team. There are some Bulls fans that I see in the comments every single day that think this team is going to compete for a 6th or 7th seed. Listen, I wish I saw it. I don't. But I've been wrong before, and I'm going to be wrong again, and maybe this is one that I'm wrong on. And if the Bulls do, and right, I focus a lot on if they're losing. If this Bulls team does exceed expectation, let's say they exceed those expectations. I'm not saying you need to make those moves by the trade deadline, but if this team finishes the season far above where a lot of people think the Bulls are going to finish the season, at that point in the offseason, it's still your job to buy into that direction and make your move. You have to be more aggressive in supporting what you see this team needs if that's the case. And let's hope, I would much more so be talking about it at the end of this season. Hey, that Bulls team surprise. You know what we need? Let's make some complementary moves. Let's get in some pieces here that can help support these players that all took steps up. Let's get those guys in here so that we can be this team, this scrappy team that's going on these playoff runs that may only win two games in the first round. But listen, we're developing because we're younger, right? I would love to have that. Right now, we're a young team that isn't shaped up to be that good, but if that changes over the course of that season, let's hope that that's the case as well. So let me know what you guys feel on that down below. With that said, there's one training camp roster battle going on, and that comes down to Arnold Batum fighting off THT, Kenny Lofton Jr., right? EJ Liddell, these guys that are coming in trying to earn roster spots with the Chicago Bulls. Now, I do think EJ Liddell is more destined for the Windy City Bulls with his Exhibit 10 deal. THT is really the only threat to me. I know people, Kenny Lofton Jr. maybe. I mean, listen, all these guys are going to be trying to compete for a roster spot. Nobody's coming in and like, oh, I'm going to be on the Windy City Bulls this year. I got an Exhibit 10 deal. That means I'm going to get a little bit of extra money by going down to the Windy City Bulls. Make no mistake. All these guys want to make an NBA roster. EJ Liddell wants to be on an NBA roster. Kenny Lofton Jr. wants to be on an NBA roster, right? These guys want to compete. THT can't go on a at least not on a two-way contract, right? He can sign the G League deal outright, but he probably wants to be on an NBA roster. The final roster spot battle is the only battle that's up. It's the only non-guaranteed spot. Yes, Javon Carter is going to be on this team unless he's traded between now and the start of the season. And Arnold has to fight these guys off. Now, he's at 25, right? And a player that disappointed last season per, I think, his own expectations. But he got hurt in the eye kind of early into that season for the Bulls, and he kind of fell off, right? The shooting that we expected from him wasn't really there. The on-ball creativity wasn't really there. And Arnold he's not a guy either who's just going to let these guys come in and take his roster spot. But there is a battle for this final roster spot, and that is one of the things as well. The last couple of years, we're looking at who's going to win that starting point guard. This year, to me, it's who's going to win that final spot, and that may mean that we're seeing more of THT. We're seeing more of Kenny Lofton Jr. We're seeing more of Arnold Batum here in these preseason games, and let's see who comes out on top of that. Let me know what you guys think on that down below. Who gets that final roster spot with the Chicago Bulls? Is it Arnold? Is it Kenny Lofton Jr.? Is it THT? Is it EJ Liddell? Who do you guys have getting that final roster spot? But with that said, we got one mailbag that I want to get into. This one's from Reginald. It's kind of topical, so I didn't want it to wait till next week's mailbag on the weekend. This one's from Reggie.
Hey, this is Reginald from Columbus, Georgia. I know it's probably like a day or two late, but just watching the Julius Randle trade to Minnesota by the Knicks had me just upset because that was a very aggressive move that helped out their team. And I'm looking at Chicago, I'm just thinking that's probably never going to be at least not this year, or maybe even not next year. Because what I see during this offseason for us, I'm looking at a team making an offer for Zach LaVine that was just straight up garbage. Maybe salary cap dumps, teams 4th or 5th best player, maybe in hopes of getting to Zach LaVine, who would immediately make their team playoff contender, if not a championship contender. And I'm looking at the Bulls like, when are you guys going to make a move that's going to make your team better now instead of hoping to get some picks in the future that may or may not work out? And when I look at this Bulls team, when I look at this Bulls front office, and I just can't see them being aggressive. I can't see them saying, we're going to make our team better in the obvious way. Like, we're going to sign younger players who can help us right now shore up our weaknesses, offensively, defensively, whatever. So my question to you is, do we need to see front office changes to get a playoff or championship caliber team for Chicago?
All right, so yes, the Julius Randle, Karl-Anthony Towns trade was an aggressive move from both teams. And the Knicks continually make moves to make their roster better. Now, as far as the Bulls being aggressive, here's the thing that I'll tell you, right? It is about timing and being aggressive. And even in me wanting to see this Bulls front office be more aggressive, it's still about timing. Because we were aggressive when we went and got DeMar DeRozan, got Zoe, got Nikola Vucevic, got Alex Caruso, right? But we are aggressive too early. We gave up a lot of assets to build that team, and that team's ceiling was a first-round playoff exit by what we've seen. Now, had that team stayed healthy and we've been able to focus on other things in previous off seasons, I do think they would have gone further than that. But again, that's not what happened. The ceiling that this team reached was one playoff win in the first round. That's what that version of that team reached. It is. It's in the history books. We've moved on from it. That's what that ceiling of that team ended up being. Now, yeah, so we can talk about the woulda, coulda, shoulda all day, but that's what that ceiling ended up being. And so you don't want to go aggressive too early, because if you go aggressive too early, you can lock yourself into a roster that just isn't going to go anywhere. But you still want to see them be more aggressive than what they have been and have that direction. And I think the Bulls, that's the biggest thing from this front office this upcoming year. Find your direction and live in that and be more aggressive in that direction. And let's hope that we can see that from the Bulls, Reggie. I hope so. It remains to be seen, but we'll be watching, and we'll be covering it right here. Make sure you guys are following the show at Bulls Central Pod. You can send us any feedback, questions, comments, concerns. BullsCentralPod@gmail.com. Lastly, if you want to leave a text message and our voicemail for the mailbag, the number to do so, 773-270-2799. We are the number one spot for everything Chicago Bulls related, but that's thanks to you guys. And like I like to end every episode on, go Bulls. Love you guys. See red if you can, y'all. Peace.
This has been a presentation of the Break Media.